It was the evening of June 3rd, 1942. The sun was sinking into the vast Pacific Ocean, turning the sky orange and red. Hundreds of miles from the nearest city, aboard the aircraft carrier Enterprise, young American pilots sat quietly beside their aircraft. Some checked maps, some stared at the sea, others pretended to relax. But deep down, nearly every man understood the same thing. Tomorrow, many of them might not come back. The Pacific War was only 6 months old, but it already felt endless. Since the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces had swept across Asia and the Pacific with stunning speed. Their navy seemed unstoppable. Their pilots seemed untouchable. Again and again, American airmen found themselves facing Japanese fighters that could turn tighter, climb faster, and outmaneuver almost anything the United States had in the sky. For American pilots, one aircraft in particular had become the source of countless nightmares: the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. The Zero was unlike anything many American pilots had ever faced. It was light, fast, and incredibly agile. In a turning fight, it could circle around most American aircraft with ease. Pilots who tried to outturn a Zero often paid with their lives. As darkness settled over the carrier deck, many American aviators were thinking about those very dangers. They had heard the stories. They had seen the reports. They knew experienced pilots who had gone into battle and never returned. Yet, among those preparing for another day of combat was a man whose observations would eventually change the air war in the Pacific. His name was Lieutenant Commander John S. Thach. At first glance, Thach did not seem like the kind of man destined to revolutionize aerial combat. He was calm, thoughtful, and analytical. While many people imagined fighter pilots as reckless daredevils, he studied problems carefully. He looked for patterns. Most importantly, he understood that courage alone could not defeat a superior opponent. Months earlier, Thach had been deeply concerned by intelligence reports coming from China and other battle zones. Again and again, reports described Japanese fighters outperforming enemy aircraft in turning engagements. The message was becoming impossible to ignore. If American pilots entered traditional dogfights against Zeros, they would often lose. Many people focused on improving aircraft performance. Some hoped newer fighters would solve the problem. Others believed aggressive tactics could compensate. Thach wasn't convinced. He believed the answer might lie somewhere else. He began asking a simple question. What if American pilots stopped fighting the way Japanese pilots expected? That question would lead to one of the most important tactical innovations of the war. But before the tactic could prove itself, the situation in the Pacific would become even more desperate. Just one day after that evening aboard Enterprise, American and Japanese forces would collide near Midway Atoll in one of the most important naval battles in history. The Battle of Midway would determine the future balance of power in the Pacific, and in the skies above that battle, a new idea would face its first real test. Months before Midway, Thach had spent countless hours studying available information about Japanese aircraft. Every report seemed to point toward the same conclusion. The Zero's greatest strength was maneuverability. Its pilots loved turning engagements. If an American fighter tried to stay behind a Zero by matching its turns, the American pilot would often find himself losing the contest. Thach realized that fighting on Japanese terms was exactly what Japanese pilots wanted. So he started thinking differently. Instead of focusing on one aircraft fighting one aircraft, he focused on teamwork. What if two fighters could work together as a single weapon? The idea sounds simple today. At the time, it was revolutionary. Using matchsticks placed on a tabletop, Thach began demonstrating a maneuver to fellow pilots. The concept involved two fighters flying side by side with some distance between them. If an enemy fighter attacked one aircraft from behind, both American fighters would turn toward each other. As they crossed paths, the pursuing enemy would suddenly find himself exposed to gunfire from the second American fighter. Then, the maneuver could be repeated again and again. Each crossing created a deadly trap. A Japanese pilot chasing one fighter would unknowingly place himself in front of the guns of another. The tactic became known as the Thach Weave. On paper, it seemed brilliant. But paper and combat were very different things. Many military ideas look excellent during planning and fail completely under real battlefield conditions. The question remained, would it work against experienced Japanese aces? Nobody truly knew. As the Battle of Midway approached, that answer would finally come. On the morning of June 4, 1942, the Pacific sky filled with aircraft. American carriers launched fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. Japanese carriers launched their own waves of aircraft. Soon, thousands of men were engaged in one of the most important battles of the Second World War. The air was filled with danger. Engines roared, machine guns rattled. Aircraft climbed, dove, and turned across enormous stretches of sky. For many pilots, visibility changed from moment to moment. 1 second, the sky appeared empty. The next second, enemy fighters appeared from nowhere. During one critical engagement, Thach and his wingman, Ensign Edward Butch O'Hare's squadron members, encountered Japanese fighters. Among them were highly skilled Zero pilots. The situation quickly became dangerous. Japanese fighters moved into attack positions, the kind of situation that had cost many Allied pilots their lives. But this time, something was different. Instead of attempting to outturn the Zeros individually, Thach and his partner began executing the maneuver they had practiced. They turned toward each other, crossed paths, separated, then repeated the movement, again and again. To observers, it almost looked like a dance. But it was a deadly. Japanese pilots pursuing one American aircraft suddenly found themselves exposed to fire from the other. Attackers were forced to break away. Opportunities disappeared. Angles vanished. The comfortable advantages Japanese pilots normally enjoyed began slipping away. For perhaps the first time, some of the best fighter pilots in the world encountered a defensive system specifically designed to exploit their aggression. The beauty of the tactic was its simplicity. The more determined the attacker became, the more vulnerable he could become. The Weave transformed individual aircraft into a coordinated defensive network. Instead of isolated targets, Japanese pilots faced mutually supporting fighters. As combat continued, the tactic demonstrated exactly what Thach had hoped. American pilots no longer needed to beat Zeros at their greatest strength. They only needed discipline, timing, and teamwork. The psychological impact was enormous. Before tactics like the Thach Weave became widespread, many American pilots viewed the Zero with a mixture of fear and respect. Its reputation seemed almost mythical, but successful encounters began changing perceptions. The Zero was still dangerous, its pilots were still skilled, but they were not invincible. That realization mattered. Wars are fought with machines, but they are also fought with confidence. Once American aviators learned that Japanese fighters could be countered, their entire approach began evolving. Throughout 1942, combat across the Pacific continued relentlessly. The campaign around Guadalcanal became especially brutal. Pilots flew exhausting missions over vast distances. Every sortie carried enormous risk. The skies above the Solomon Islands became some of the most dangerous airspace on Earth. Here again, teamwork proved essential. The Thach Weave spread among squadrons because it worked. Pilots taught it to new arrivals. Combat veterans demonstrated its value. Young aviators practiced it repeatedly until the movements became instinctive. Whenever Japanese fighters attempted to isolate a target, coordinated American pilots could create overlapping fields of fire. This dramatically complicated enemy attacks. The tactic was particularly valuable because it helped offset aircraft performance differences. American pilots did not always have the most maneuverable fighters, but they increasingly possessed something equally powerful. Coordination. As the war continued, new American aircraft entered service. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat arrived. Later came the Vought F-4U Corsair. These fighters offered major improvements in speed, firepower, and survivability. Yet tactics remained critically important. Even superior equipment can fail if used poorly. The lessons pioneered by Thach continued influencing pilot training throughout the conflict. Meanwhile, Japanese aviation faced growing challenges. Many of the experienced pilots who had formed the core of Japan's pre-war air force were gradually lost in combat. Replacing them proved difficult. Training programs struggled to keep pace with wartime losses. The result was a widening gap in experience. American forces increasingly benefited from better pilot rotation systems, larger training pipelines, and expanding industrial production. But tactical innovation helped accelerate that advantage. The Thach Weave represented something larger than a single maneuver. It represented a philosophy. Instead of asking how one pilot could defeat another, it asked how a team could defeat an opponent together. That idea became increasingly important as air combat evolved. Looking back, it is easy to underestimate how significant this shift. Movies often focus on lone heroes winning dramatic duels. Real combat rarely works that way. Success usually comes from coordination, preparation, communication, and discipline. The Thach Weave embodied those principles perfectly. Its effectiveness became so well known that it influenced fighter tactics beyond the Pacific War. Military organizations around the world studied coordinated defensive maneuvers. The concept of mutual support became a central element of fighter operations. In many ways, Thach's idea anticipated broader developments in modern air combat. The man himself remained remarkably humble. John Thach never portrayed himself as a genius who single-handedly changed the war. He understood that victory depended on thousands of people. Pilots, mechanics, intelligence officers, ship crews, commanders, everyone played a role. Yet history continues to remember him because he solved a problem that seemed impossible. At a time when Japanese fighters appeared dominant, he refused to accept conventional thinking. Instead of asking how to match the Zero's strengths, he searched for its weaknesses. That difference in perspective changed everything. Imagine yourself sitting in a fighter cockpit over the Pacific in 1942. The engine shakes the aircraft, the ocean stretches endlessly below, the sky appears empty. Then suddenly an enemy fighter appears behind you. Your heart races. Every instinct tells you to focus only on survival. But instead of acting alone, you trust your wingman. You begin the weave. You turn. He turns. The distance closes. The paths cross. And suddenly the hunter becomes the target. That simple moment captures why the tactic succeeded. It transformed fear into confidence, isolation into cooperation, vulnerability into strength. Many military breakthroughs involve advanced technology, new weapons, new machines, new inventions. The Thach Weave was different. It required no new aircraft, no new engines, no new guns. Its power came from human thinking, from understanding behavior, from recognizing that the enemy expected one thing and delivering another. Those kinds of innovations often have the greatest impact because they change the way people see problems. Throughout the war, countless American pilots benefited from lessons first developed by Thach. Many probably never met him personally. Some may not have fully understood the origins of the maneuver they practiced. Yet the influence remained. Every successful defense, every pilot who returned home, every engagement where teamwork defeated superior maneuverability, all carried traces of that original idea. As the Pacific War moved toward its conclusion, American air power grew overwhelming. New aircraft dominated the sky. Japanese aviation struggled to recover. The balance had shifted dramatically. But behind that transformation stood countless moments of adaptation and innovation. The Thach Weave was one of the most important. Not because it won the war alone, no single tactic could do that. Its importance lay in what it represented: the willingness to learn, the willingness to adapt, the willingness to challenge assumptions. Those qualities often determine victory long before the shooting starts. On that evening before Midway, as nervous pilots prepared for another dangerous mission, nobody could fully see the future. They could not know which aircraft would return, which ships would survive, which battles would become legendary. But one pilot carried an idea that would help reshape an idea born not from superior machinery, but from careful observation. An idea tested under the most dangerous conditions imaginable. An idea that showed even the most feared opponent could be beaten. And that is why the story of John Thach remains so powerful today. Because at its heart, it is not merely a story about airplanes or dogfights. It is a story about solving impossible problems. When everyone else saw a superior enemy fighter, Thach saw a puzzle. When others focused on what the Zero could do, he focused on what it could not do. When conventional tactics failed, he created new ones. The result was a maneuver so effective that some of the most skilled Japanese aces suddenly found themselves facing a challenge they had never expected. Not a faster airplane, not a bigger gun, not a secret weapon, just two disciplined pilots working together. In the end, that was the real breakthrough. The Pacific War produced countless stories of bravery. Pilots flew into overwhelming danger. Many never returned. Their courage deserves lasting respect. But courage alone is rarely enough. The men who ultimately gained the advantage combined bravery with innovation, teamwork, and adaptability. High above the endless Pacific, amid roaring engines and flashing gunfire, one American pilot proved a lesson that still matters today. The strongest opponent is not always defeated by greater strength. Sometimes he is defeated by a better idea. And that better idea, born from matchsticks on a tabletop and tested in the skies of war, helped turn the hunter into the hunted and changed aerial combat for